Hello and welcome to the show. My guest today came here on a one-year writer's scholarship in the year 2000 from New Zealand, arriving with no German and little knowledge of Germany. And she's never left. She's still here 14 years later. She's been enchanted by this city, Berlin. Meanwhile, Sarah Quigley is a celebrated author. Indeed, in her native country, her latest novel stayed at the top of the bestseller list there for nearly half a year. Welcome to the show. Indeed, I believe you're a national treasure there and they want you back.
I think they were slightly alarmed that it was the first time that they had run this residency for a New Zealand writer who then was supposed to come back to New Zealand and report on Germany. And actually, I think it was 3 or 4 years before I even returned to New Zealand, but only for a visit. And I think they envisaged almost all their writers running off on this residency and then staying in Berlin.
Oh, dear. But did the ones after you? You were actually you received the first one, didn't you?
I did. I received the...
Are there now 14 more New Zealand writers in Berlin?
No, in fact, everybody except for me has gone home. I think it was just... I think because I had the inaugural residency, it was a sort of a trial run for Creative New Zealand, which is like the Arts Council of New Zealand, to see if it would work to place a writer in a foreign environment. And I have to say, for the first 2 or 3 months, it didn't work. I was just so extremely, I guess, sort of ill at ease because I arrived in Berlin. I'd only found out 3 months before I arrived here that I was coming to Germany. So I was really sort of thrown out there and I just had to swim as hard as I could. I had no German whatsoever. And I think because of all the effort that I invested in those first few months, I kind of got this feeling after the year was up that I'm just beginning to enjoy Berlin. I'm discovering so many different facets to the city. And now I want to just enjoy myself for a while. And 14 years later, I'm still enjoying myself.
Yeah, 14 years later. And many books later. I should just mention, we've got the latest book, The Conductor, which is fabulous. We'll talk about that later, and we've got a signed copy to give away as well. What I want to talk about, though, is language, because, of course, you as a writer, language is all important. And you told me on the phone, quite surprisingly, I found, a few days ago, that you don't want to learn German too well. Can you tell us why?
Exactly. I mean, I think it's very much a double-edged sword and it's still something that I struggle with a lot. I really feel embarrassed that I'm living in Germany and I'm still not fluent in German. But after I'd been here for a couple of years, I enrolled in an intensive German language course and I went there every day for 5 hours a day for 2 months. And I was becoming reasonably fluent. And then I realised that my English was slowing up so badly that I was just struggling to find the words that I needed to write my novels every day. And it was a very strange experience. I just felt as if I was no longer adept in English and I was far from adept in German. So I think it is definitely specific to the job. I just really found that I almost had to start to block German out to remain skilled in my own language.
And do you still block it out then, to a certain extent? I mean, you must be, presumably you can buy in shops and things like that, no problem at all.
I think you end up with about 30 stock phrases for supermarket shopping, rides in a taxi, a chat in a corner kiosk or something. And then you realise how very easy it is to get by with goodwill and a bit of sign language. And
the Germans, it has to be said, they love to have a go at English, don't they?
Well, they're absolutely lovely. I find the Germans here so extremely generous. And actually, when I do start off in German and they instantly hear that I can't speak it very well, I mean, they almost always switch to English, which I find extremely welcoming. And I love that about Berlin. It really, truly feels like an international city.
But your novel has been published in German. Have you tried to read your own words in German?
Well, Robin, I hate reading my own books. I have to say, after I've sent them away with the final proof, I very rarely look back at them. So, of course, out of curiosity, I looked at the translation and I was very lucky to have an extremely sympathetic a translator who lives in Potsdam. So we were actually able to meet a couple of times and discuss certain problems that she had with idioms or even specific words that she wasn't quite sure about. And that's a huge luxury for a writer because normally you don't get to meet your translators at all.
No, I imagine not.
Yeah, so I mean, from what I've read of the German version of The Conductor, I think it's beautiful. She's done a very beautiful job, and she's actually a musician herself. And as the novel is a lot about music, that was also very beneficial.
Yeah. You say you don't like reading your own books. Do you mind doing that? Do you mind book signings, and do you mind reading aloud?
Signing a book is very much easier than writing one.
Presumably you give readings.
I do give readings, and actually I very much enjoy it, and I think it's because you get to feel the words in a kind of a rhythmic or almost musical way that you don't get to experience when you're writing or editing them. So for me, when I'm reading something that I've written, it becomes something other than myself, and then I am more the performer and less the writer. And I think that's very interesting for a writer because you get a kind of a chasm between yourself and the work. And you get to see how an audience responds to what you've written, which is also, I mean, as you'll know, feedback like that is absolutely invaluable and you can always learn from it.
We'll hear more about the book in a minute, but right now let's see more of Sarah Quigley's Berlin. She's going to show you around various parts of this city, starting at one of her favourite cafes.
Café Hackbart is a popular hangout for artists and for Sarah Quigley, a home away from home. The writer from New Zealand arrived in Berlin in the year 2000, planning to stay for a year. But the city took hold of her. Her first apartment was in the heart of Berlin's central Mitte district.
This was my first front door in Berlin, and a very busy thoroughfare. I think thousands of visitors came past my front door every day, and sometimes late at night the doorbell would ring when I was in bed, and I would open the door and it would be some party goers who were like, "Oh, we thought you were part of the gallery."
This used to be Sarah's neighborhood bar.
2 weeks ago, this little Kneipe out Berlin closed its doors forever.
The traditional Berlin pub was forced out of business by dramatic rent hikes. Mitte is changing, and Sarah has a new home in a less central district.
I put fake roses on my balcony because they make me feel happy when I wake up in the morning and look at them. And a lot of my dresses are floral prints, and I absolutely love them.
She now lives next to a huge park where she likes to run, just as she used to when she lived in London and in San Francisco.
Everyone in London runs to work for 40 minutes with their suits and their backpacks. And when I arrived in Berlin, it was a very strange thing to do. And workmen used to sit there and go, "Schneller, schneller, 1, 2, 1, 2." And I would feel so stupid running. But now, as you see, it's become one of Berliners' favorite things to do.
Before she came to Berlin, she often wrote in cafes, but now she prefers to work at home. She took cello and piano lessons when she was younger, but later it was literature that took more and more of her time. Her best-selling novel, The Conductor, combines her two passions. It's based on the story of how Dmitri Shostakovich composed his 7th Symphony during one of the major battles of World War II. Long walks along the Spree on Museum Island inspired Sarah to write this extraordinary tale.
And we heard snippets of Shostakovich there, the 7th Symphony, which the book is very basically about. I mean, is that what first inspired you to write that?
It's actually not. I grew up with a lot of music around me, and I played the cello and the piano for a long time. And then I basically decided to focus on literature and on writing. And I think when I arrived in Berlin, I had missed music as a part of my life for such a long time, but I hadn't really realised that or acknowledged it. And then a couple of years after I arrived here, I was living in Warschauer Strasse, which at that time, and it was about 10 years ago, was pretty bleak still, actually.
This is the former East.
The former East.
Of Berlin, which was sort of bleaker, if you like.
Yes, exactly.
In the West.
It was an interesting place to live. It was very raggedy, and I mean, if you crossed the bridge into Kreuzberg, you were into West Berlin. But it felt very Eastern to me, and I think that started making me think, well, about what it would have been like to live under a repressive regime. And this was sort of brewing up under the surface, and at that time, I used to love to go and get a Sunday English newspaper, which was one of the things I most missed about living in England. And it was very hard to get a British newspaper on the weekend here. And I found at Ostbahnhof, they usually had 2 copies of The Guardian or The Observer. And if you didn't get there early enough in the day, they were gone before the days when you could read newspapers online. So I used to rush pretty early on a Sunday to get The Observer before some other expat went and snatched it. So I was sitting there reading The Observer, and I read an article about the performance of Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony in Leningrad in 1942.
This is during the siege of Leningrad. I wanted to sort of just explain to our viewers the story a little bit, because it is he wrote it during the siege of Leningrad when, I mean, in the end, over 2 million people died. Many of starvation on the Russian side, of course.
And almost 1 million during that first winter, 1941 to 1942, which was when Shostakovich he started the symphony in 1941, and then he was evacuated before the winter. And so this started to simmer away in my mind, and I thought that it would make an extraordinarily interesting novel. And so to me, it was sort of my love of Shostakovich's music infused into this story about the war and about the courage of the ordinary Leningraders during that first winter.
Is it difficult, because you actually, in the book, is Shostakovich, is Elias Berg, the conductor who eventually did that first performance. So they're real people, but you're writing them fictionally. Is that difficult to do? Because
I felt quite uneasy about it at the beginning. Yeah. And the other thing was that, I mean, because when you're dealing with real historical facts, there are simply places that your imagination can't go. So often I would sort of turn down a street where I wanted to go, and there would be a brick wall, because it was like, that didn't happen, that couldn't have happened. So I think my academic work came very much into play there, because I started to use my experience that I'd gained for my doctorate in a sort of a novelistic way, and I would research a bit, and then I would write a bit, and then I needed to find out more, so I would research and write. So it became very much a sort of symbiotic process. And it took a very long time. I mean, there were many times I wished that I simply hadn't started, but because Shostakovich and Elias Berg had really lived and were real people, I began to feel almost a sense of responsibility towards them.
And did you go to St. Petersburg, well, Leningrad, what is now St. Petersburg?
I intended to, and then after a couple of years of writing and researching, I realised that it was going to become quite disruptive to the writing process if I went to St. Petersburg, as it is today. Yeah,
as it is today, yeah, of course.
I had been looking at old maps from that time, from the late 1930s and the early 40s, and I had, by that stage, created such a detailed world in my head of how Leningrad was that I actually feared that if I went to St. Petersburg and possibly saw things I didn't want to see, that I simply wouldn't be able to finish the novel. So I didn't go in the end. I still haven't been.
It's extraordinary, because I mean, we've talked about, but I'm really enjoying it, I should say, and I actually got a copy from Sarah last week, and I could have quickly read it by the time of this interview, but it is so beautifully written. I want to savour every line, so I'm only 2/3 of the way through it, and I don't want to finish it. Anyway, enough praise from me. You can win a copy, a signed copy of this wonderful book, The Conductor. Write to us at insight@dw.de, and you could be our lucky winner. Once again, the book's called The Conductor by Sarah Quigley, who's my guest, and it really is an extraordinary book, I have to say. Let's talk about Berlin, because you love Berlin. You said it even tops San Francisco, where you lived. What is it about this city, especially for you? I mean, you've told us a little bit, but tell us more. I mean...
I think the things that I didn't like at the beginning, in the first few months, I've actually come to value, because there's this Berliner Schnauzer, the famous Berliner attitude of that sort of slight grumpiness and sort of slap in your face, like, not going to like you just because you are polite to me, sort of thing. And for a New Zealander, that's quite a cultural shock, actually, because New Zealanders, they're extremely friendly on the whole and generally extremely polite. A little in that British way. And for me, coming, especially, I mean, I think Berlin has changed a lot since I arrived and is still changing. But living in the former East, where I was first living, there was quite a sort of brusque attitude, which I found pretty difficult. And after a while, I actually came to value it, because I really think you save a lot of time by saying what you think, right? I mean, it's much better just simply to say, I don't like that, or I disagree with you.
The Berliners call a spade.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah. And I really do appreciate that now. And I think, I mean, there are so many facets about Berlin that I like, but that is a true Berliner thing, which I really very much like.
I wonder about the culture as well. I mean, that you're an avid musician yourself. I mean, that's quite clear from the way you write in the book. I thought you must be a musician, the way you describe Shostakovich composing. So do you enjoy the sort of cultural side of the city too?
I mean, culturally, I think it's just a treasure trove. I find it absolutely extraordinary here that you can hear top-class music every night of the week. I mean, you can go to theatre. The movie culture is just fantastic. And actually, the visual arts scene is the one that I sort of plunged into when I first arrived here. And most of the people I met in that first year were visual artists, because I was living in Kunstwerke. And I just think it's very real in a cultural sense as well, because there are people here who are just doing what they want to do because they have a passion for it. And there doesn't seem to be such an emphasis on social standing or status here. There are so many different levels of culture that you can enter.
You can wear anything you like.
Exactly. I think it's just wonderfully free, and basically whatever scene you are into, you can find your niche in Berlin and you can be comfortable there. And there's a kind of a dignity to being an artist or a writer here that I find very reassuring. And it is really not necessarily reputation-based, which I like very much. It's more about the fact that you're following the path that you feel as if you need to follow.
I know you've been around other parts of Germany. Is it very different, do you find, to the rest of Germany?
I do find it different here. I like the... actually, I read in Die Zeit magazine the other day, an artist had described Berlin as... he liked it because the German element here was very shy. And I liked that because I think it doesn't feel particularly German here. It feels Berlin, and I like that. Berlin has its own kind of tolerance.
It's getting more international, isn't it?
Yeah. But I think, I mean, the tolerance here, the sort of that sort of just quite slow pace that Berlin has, which I like very much. And I think, I mean, the rest of Germany feels different. Of course, I mean, every region has something else to offer. And, I mean, Bavaria, I love the mountains, and I love the beautiful landscapes around Lake Constance, for instance. But Berlin as a city, I think, has something very special.
Is this Berlin? I don't... This is another photo you sent in to us.
That was at a...
there you are in the middle.
It was in New York, in Manhattan.
George on the... Yeah. Oh, that's in New York?
Yes, it is. My agent is on the left there, and he was Boy George's agent. And I happened to be in New York for a week when he was there, and The man on the right is Boy George's ghostwriter. He was writing a biography, an autobiography for Boy George. And there was a huge show launched on Broadway about Boy George's life called Taboo, after the club.
Well, I had no idea. It's completely out of context.
And it was just a mad, crazy party.
Oh, right. OK.
Yeah.
Coming back to Berlin. Berlin's getting a bit overcrowded, though, isn't it?
Indeed.
I mean, is it because of people like us talking about it and saying how wonderful it is and things like that?
I think so. I mean, at the time I arrived, there was sort of a low-level buzz about Berlin, but it still felt fairly undiscovered. And most of the artists and musicians I knew here were living in unheated one-room apartments with, for instance, coal ovens or broken windows in the staircase. In the winters, ice on the inside of the window panes, and that was in central Mitte. And I think after 5 or 6 years, you know, in the sort of mid-2000s, that buzz became more and more hyped. And now I think the very things that Berlin is renowned for are actually disappearing, which is plenty of space, a very laid-back attitude, low rents, low living costs.
Yeah. People like my guests have been singing the praises of this city for a long time now, and inevitably its popularity is making property here, especially in the centre of town, as you've just said, more and more expensive.
Smack dab in the centre of Berlin, a most desirable location. Maria Janssen wants to buy an apartment near the Brandenburg Gate. It's the last major building site in this area. Estate agent Nicholas Ziegert is here to advise clients. This is to become the site of luxury apartments. 2/3 of them have already been sold.
The fact that there's no building standing here yet is putting off neither our Berlin nor our international clients who are preparing to invest in this unique location. Prices range between 4,500 and 10,500 euros.
That's per square metre. A penthouse on the top floor will be going for about 2.3 million euros. Far too much for an average wage earner, but not for Maria and her husband, a management consultant. Her prospective neighbours are fashion designers and business people.
Here you've got political Berlin and all kinds of cultural amenities within walking distance. And thinking with an eye to the future, it's a solid investment. By the time the house is completed, I'm sure there won't be any flats available anymore.
But not everyone is in favour of this development. These residents are afraid of being driven out of popular districts like Kreuzberg, Mitte or Neukölln. One of them is Tom Habrücker.
We want to live in the center, just like everyone else, and that's what we're fighting for. We're fighting against displacement and the commercial exploitation of people living in their homes.
Tom has lived in the city's trendy Neukölln district for 4 years, but now his building has been sold. It's unclear whether the new owner will leave things as they are or carry out expensive renovations. Tom currently pays about 500 euros a month for his 50 square metre apartment. That includes heating. He works as a chef and couldn't afford to pay more. In the last few years, rents in Berlin have risen by about 30%.
Things are becoming gentrified, in the sense that only people who can afford it are living here. And in a sense, everything else is disappearing, especially the reason people come here.
Meanwhile, in the city centre, Maria Janssen is off to have a look at the exact location of the apartments still to be snapped up. She's surprised to find many have already been sold. Parquet floors, shower fittings, panelling or wallpaper. It's all up to the buyer. It's only the best here. But for the vast majority of Berlin's residents, a perfectly tailored apartment is an unaffordable luxury. Most would be happy just to find something affordable in the German capital. And things seem to be getting worse. More and more long-term tenants in the centre of Berlin are being driven out.
My guest is Sarah Quigley, a writer originally from New Zealand. Do you think things are getting worse? I mean, apart from the prices, do you think
I was
sort
interested
of Berlin
to hear...
that you love and cherished for the last 14 years, do you think it's changing completely now? Or
I was interested to hear the reporter using the word worse, the value judgment, because a lot of people would say that it's getting better, right? Less shabby, more glossy, more glamorous.
Yeah.
But I really find it's losing a character that it had, and it was that sort of creative, raw edge to it that was there. I hear right through the 90s, which must have been a fascinating time to be here, and into the 2000s. But yeah, I think it's just normalising in a way, becoming like any other capital city. And as soon as tourists flock here for long weekends and push the residents out of the inner city, then what the tourists are coming for is actually not there anymore, ironically.
But there's still a lot of artists here, generally.
A lot of artists, yeah. I have found that the gallery scene has become very much more commercial and much more, well, glossified, if you like. And the small independent galleries have either disappeared or have been pushed out away from the centre. And so very much here, it feels a little more like London does to me, actually. You know, with
quite
the
the London
galleries.
prices yet.
Not yet, no.
Not yet, but it could come. Let's go all the way across the other side of the world to where you come from Christchurch, New Zealand. You said at the beginning that when you were here, you didn't go back for 2 or 3 years. So is there nothing you feel... Do you feel no affinity towards to New Zealand?
I was thinking about this the other day, actually. Somebody was talking about feeling homesick, and I realised I never feel homesick. I simply don't pine for one place. And I think possibly that's an advantage as a writer, because it's almost as if you carry your security with you. I mean, I actually feel homesick for the act of writing when I'm not writing. For instance, if I'm on a reading tour, I just long to be in my room with the door closed, working on my books. But New Zealand to me, I mean, it's given me a lot. I have so many people back there who are so dear to me, and I absolutely love going back. But when I'm there, I feel a kind of a restlessness, and I want to get back to Europe. And New Zealand feels extremely isolated to me, and
So
I think it always has.
This doesn't move you. It moves me. I think this is the cutest photo. Which one are you?
The blonde one on the left, and the neon orange.
And what's this? This is gorgeous.
This was... I mean, I had a wonderfully privileged childhood. My parents were lovely people who very often wanted to escape city life. And so they found a very isolated shepherd's hut right up the top of this mountain valley. They knew the farmer. And so for 2 weeks, every summer, we would disappear as a family up there. We would take a trailer behind our Range Rover full of gear, like camping gear, canoes and things. And we would go to the library in Christchurch, and we would take out the maximum number of books each, which was 20 books each. So we ended up with 100 books. There were 5 of us. And we had these boxes of books. So we had a library for 2 weeks. And this hut was so isolated. There was no electricity, no phones, no cell phones in those days. So for 2 weeks, it was just us with that valley that you woke up every day in this hut. You had to light the fire to boil water. And you just looked up this incredibly beautiful valley, which I think is the landscape that has sort of shaped me, and that I really, really miss that sort of feeling of enormous space and timelessness.
And did you read all the books? Not all 100, but did you read your 20?
We all read right through it. We were like locusts, just reading madly. So by the time the last day came, we were down to our last tin of baked beans and our last book.
And is that actually what got you to write? Is that?
I'm sure
were you just a voracious reader?
Absolutely. I'm really sure it was. Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about... Oh, another picture, yes. This is somewhere... I know this is actually here in Europe, but it's a Maori meeting house.
Oh,
What's
it's
that?
beautiful.
Tell us the story about that.
It's a very moving story, actually. This was a spiritual place for the Maori, which was hand-carved in the North Island of New Zealand in the very late 1800s, so in the 1890s. And at that stage, a surprising number of German explorers and collectors were travelling to Australia and New Zealand in search of this kind of thing, sort of collecting artefacts and bringing them back to Germany. And so a German collector went out there and brought this entire meeting house back to Germany in pieces on a boat in 1900. And it's been in the museum in Hamburg ever since then, since 1900. And so for the centenary of this meeting house, they wanted to restore it. This meeting house had been in a very dark room in the Ethnological Museum, basically in a basement room, for decades, kind of neglected and dusty. And so in 2000, they brought descendants of the original carvers to Germany, to Hamburg, to restore this meeting house. And they brought with them paua shell and flax and feathers from New Zealand. So they actually brought original material over to Hamburg. And in 2002, this meeting house was reopened to the public. And going to the opening was an extraordinary experience to see this sort of intermingling of Maori and German culture was just
And were the people who visited, didn't they want to take it back to New Zealand?
Well, interestingly not. I think they felt sort of satisfied that they had restored dignity to this museum. I mean, of course, there's always conflict about these things. The Elgin marbles, for instance, in the British Museum. I mean, there's this sort of strange thing.
Won't go there.
Yeah, we won't go there. No,
subject,
the atmosphere that weekend was actually extremely positive, and I felt that it had kind of reinforced a long-standing positive relationship between Germany and New Zealand, which exists in many other ways today, trade and tourism as well.
OK. I want to ask you a couple of things from your questionnaire. You answered our questionnaire in great detail. It was quite wonderful. There's some wonderful things. We've already talked about the Berliner Schnauzer. But I wanted to ask you about a peculiar German characteristic. You invented your own category, which we love that, actually. Do make up your own, and we say that, don't we? And you made up a peculiar German characteristic. Do you remember what you said?
Was it about Germans making jokes?
No, that was the good German characteristic. But tell us about that, then. All right, and we'll come to the peculiar.
Well, actually, the first German that I got to know was when I was in my 20s, and he had newly moved to New Zealand. He was running an outdoor clothing business. He was a lovely man called Frank. And when I arrived in Germany, I realised how many Germans are called Frank. And he made this fantastic joke. We were at a gallery opening and the whole room was in an uproar. And then he looked at me sideways in this slightly shy way and he said, "I bet you didn't know Germans could make jokes like that." And then he looked a little bit surprised that he had actually pulled off this coup of being the one that had turned this room into an eruption of laughter.
Oh, OK.
And I've noticed that more and more here. Germans have an extremely good sense of humour, very undervalued.
They do, yeah. But it's the cliché, you see, there.
Exactly.
Peculiar German characteristic was you can do pretty much anything in Berlin, and what you can't do is...
Jaywalk. Cross against the red, as you would say in Britain.
Yeah.
I've noticed this more and more, and it's actually something I refuse to stop doing. I just do not see the point of standing at an empty intersection for 6 minutes waiting for the light to change when there are no cars inside and no other people around.
Yeah.
So I walk, but they
it's
get
come
rather
up quite
cross.
a lot with our guests, I must say. And finally, coolest German living.
Well, I have a soft spot for Karl Lagerfeld. I love Karl Lagerfeld.
We'll find out why in a minute, but often caricatured in many different ways. I agree with Sarah about Karl Lagerfeld, although I'm not a slave to fashion. The man is well clever, as they would say in London. Here's his story in brief. He is a smart cookie, isn't he? But you put down that you like Karl Lagerfeld because of his stubbornness and single-mindedness. You like that too, then?
Well, I think what I really like about him is that he doesn't seem to ever be thrown by what people think about him or say about him. And I think if you're going to create anything, that's a really important attribute to have. I mean, if you listen to what somebody thinks of an early draft of your book, for instance, you're never going to finish it, right? Because there are so many different opinions and you take in that advice or that advice. And I think you really do need to have this kind of determination and a kind of bloody-mindedness, as we would say in English, to finish anything. And in the end, you just need to say to the world, you know, shut up, I'm going to do it my way. And that's what Lagerfeld is supremely good at doing.
But you get people to read early drafts.
Very rarely, actually. Very rarely.
Okay.
I have quite a strict policy with myself that until I feel as if something is finished, I simply won't give it to anybody to read. And then after I feel that it's finished and I do get some sort of input, I'm very open to editing at that stage, but I really need to finish a project to bring it to completion before I show it to anybody at all.
I know that The Conductor took a long time to write. I mean, do you shut yourself away to write? Or I wonder how the process is. I'm always intrigued to ask writers.
I do. I mean, I really become almost like a total hermit. And it's a strange process of denial in a way. You actually have to put yourself in that place of loneliness and often boredom, actually. It's just, you would love to go out for dinner, you would love to go out and have a drink and a chat, but if you do, you know that your process is going to be disrupted. So when I'm writing a first draft of a novel, maybe it takes 3 or 4 months, I simply become extremely strict on myself, shut myself away, work every day.
Oh, I see. The writing 3 or 4 months, you say, but you might have spent 2 years researching.
Yes.
Or what?
Well, I do a number of drafts. So the first draft to me is the one where it's most important to kind of seal yourself off in this kind of almost dreamlike bubble. And it really feels like going underwater in a way. You take a deep breath, you dive in there, and you try to stay under for as long as it takes. And once you have this first draft safely there, it becomes a little easier. But then I write probably 4 or 5 more drafts after that. Yeah.
We've almost run out of time. What's the next book going to be about? Is it going to be set in Berlin?
Actually, my next book is a book of short fiction, so it's quite different. I think it's almost like a release from writing a historical novel. It's 22 short stories based around the theme of tenderness, human kindness, that kind of lovely, rare moment when two people connect. And some of them are set in Berlin, but not specifically stated as such.
And are you set in Berlin? Is this home now?
Absolutely. Yeah, I was just thinking last week how rare it is to be able to get up in the morning and think that you're doing exactly what you want to do in the place that you want to do it in. And basically I've had that for nearly 14 years now. So I feel extraordinarily lucky, and really, if it all ended tomorrow, I would think it's been worth it, and I have Berlin to thank for that.
Well, I think we're extraordinarily lucky to have you here in Berlin. Sarah Quigley, thank you very much for joining us. I love your book. I've said it a number of times. Just to mention it again, if you'd like to win a signed hardback copy of this book, do write to us at insight@dw.de, and if you don't win it, I implore you to buy it. It's a wonderful book, and I'm sure the short stories will be as well. Thanks for being with us. Thank you for watching. Join us again at the same time next week for another Insight Germany. Until then, bye-bye.